Welcome to our 2021 Juneteenth Employee Education Program. This is a special week for GMG stations as we celebrate, commemorate, and take time to learn about the significance of Juneteenth, Freedom Day, and its place in American history. Over the last few months, your colleagues at stations across the group have been collaborating on a meaningful week of events focused on you, our employees, and many are producing memorable and impactful content to be shared with the communities we serve each day. Every corner of every station, from sales to news, creative services to engineering, business offices to Graham Digital and the GMG Design Hub, have all been a part of this collaboration. We're flexing all the creative muscle we have to engage and educate our staff and to share what we've learned and what we've built with our audiences. Some of what you'll be watching today will be molded into stories on our television stations and digital platforms. But my hope is that the learning you'll do over the next hour and the dialogue you'll have with local historians will be carried forward, not only in the relationships and understanding you build with your coworkers and partners in your communities, but also in the stories we cover for the people who count on us every day as their trusted source for news and information. Thank you for being a part of this incredible and important effort.
It's a piece of the fabric of the history of our nation right here in the heart of Texas. From the shores of Galveston Island to the space of what was once the historic Osterman Building.
To these brick-paved streets right here in Houston's Freedmanstown, where families built homes, started businesses, and raised families, and they left a legacy that still stands here today.
This is the story of Juneteenth.
It was the final blow to slavery.
On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed into law the Emancipation Proclamation as the war between the North and South was being fought.
He says that on January the 1st, 1863, all slaves in bondage will be freed in those areas that are in rebellion against the United States.
But for slaves in Texas, the freedom bell had not yet rang. While the Civil War raged on for another 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, President Lincoln continued his work to abolish slavery everywhere.
Slavery was being disestablished on the state level, and so he carried it out as commander-in-chief on the federal level. From that point on, it was very clear that if the Union wins the war, slavery is over.
Though Texas slaves were not free, news of the Emancipation Proclamation had already spread into the state.
You need to understand, slaves weren't locked on a plantation. When the overseer or the owner in a small plantation went into town, he brought the slaves with him to load the wagons or unload the goods. And they heard the news. Furthermore, on the larger plantations, the slaves who served in the big house and served dinner, you think they didn't listen to the dinner table conversation? And that night, everybody gathered and heard what the news was.
2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, on January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed by the House of Representatives, constitutionally banning slavery in the United States. Months later, in the spring of 1865, the Civil War ended.
Then on June 19, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger and Union soldiers arrived on the shores of Galveston Island. They issued General Order Number 3, freeing all slaves in the state of Texas.
At the end of the first sentence, it said all slaves are free, but at the beginning of the second sentence, it says this involves an absolute equality.
Sam Collins is a history buff.
So when you think about the words absolute and equality, you would think that equality would be enough, but he stamped it with absolute equality. We're still in pursuit of that absolute equality today.
The Galveston native loves sharing stories about his hometown, especially the story of Juneteenth.
Maya Angelou has a great quote: "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." So as I began to study this history, It is to learn the truth about what happened in this space.
In his research, Sam learned about the United States colored troops who stood alongside Union troops when they arrived in Galveston to take over Texas and free the enslaved. Harriet Smith was a slave in Hays County, Texas in the 1860s. In this conversation recorded in the year 1941, she recalls seeing the troops as they made their way through Texas.
Can you remember when the war was going on?
Of course I can. I sat on the fence at the time. Me, Cousin Lou, and Cousin Sally, and all of us, our yard had white picket fence around. The road went right along by our house. We stood on that picket fence all day long, seeing them soldiers going back to San Antonio and different places. They had to load them bugles, them horses with colored soldiers, right along by our house.
Though freed by the order, the transition from slave to freed man or woman was not instant, and by some historical accounts, met with absolute opposition, as recalled here by a former slave.
The reaction on the plantations was mixed. It depended upon the owner and of the land and the slaves. Some were very harsh, basically said, "You're free, get out of here." There were some planters in rural areas that wanted to keep the news quiet because they wanted to get the crops in. You know, they knew slavery was over.
In this slave narrative, recorded in 1941, Mrs. Laura Smalley, who was about 6 or 7 when the Union soldiers came to Texas, says her master never told her family they were free.
But now we didn't know. I don't hide the other side of the folks know freedom. We didn't know. They just thought, was just feeding us, Just had a long table. And just had just little everything you want to eat, and drink, And they said that was on the 19th. Well, see, I didn't know what that was for. Now a child 6, 7 years old can tell you.
That's right.
Yes. And old master didn't tell you, it was free.
He didn't tell you that?
No, he didn't tell. They wait till, I think now they said they wait them 6 months out of that. 6 months. And turn them loose on the 19th of June. That's why, you celebrate that day, colored folks. Celebrate that day.
The roads were crowded with slaves trying to go back to Louisiana or wherever they had come from to find the relatives they were separated from.
Some of them took the road from Galveston and settled right here in Houston.
You are looking at this historic
this is the pattern.
Yes, the crossroad pattern.
Once freed, it was here, just west of what is now downtown Houston, where they created their own community. They called it Freedmen's Town.
If you look, you see the pattern, crossroad, that would be significant in terms of pointing to different directions where things would be located.
I'm so curious about this journey as the former enslaved made their way from Galveston to Houston. They settled here in Freedmen's Town. Can you explain what that voyage was like?
It was a group of them, and they came with literally nothing.
Yeah.
So you can imagine the kinds of hardships that they went through to, find a place that they could settle, and they settled along the Buffalo Bayou.
Freed men and women from plantations in Fort Bend County and along the Brazos River southwest of Houston joined them as well.
Many of them had skill sets from the plantations. They were blacksmiths, they were artisans of various kinds of crafts that they brought with them too. A lot of them didn't bring those kinds of skills, so you had a collective, a group of people who could put skills together to start the process of building a new home, a new community. This is the first school.
Dr. Theo Harrington is with the Rutherford B. Yates Museum, which was founded in 1996. The museum was actually the Yates home and now houses historical images, even artifacts from those first settlers of Freedmen's Town.
We started operating it as a living museum that tells the story of the print museum.
Rutherford B. Yates was a printer and the son of John Henry Jack Yates, pastor of Antioch Missionary Baptist Church, the first African-American church in Houston. Jack Yates is known as one of the 4 founders of Freedmen's Town, along with Reverend Ned Pullum and J. Vance Lewis. Their original homes still remain in Freedmen's Town, And so do the historic red bricks laid by freed men. As I drove in, I drove over the infamous red bricks to get here. We've done numerous stories on these bricks, but I really want you to elaborate and talk about the significance of them.
The bricks in Freemanstown has got a lot of attention, but perhaps not enough, because they are over 100 years old. They were as a result of Freedmen's in the Houston area wanting to get a road done to avoid walking in mud. And so they petitioned the city of Houston in 1907 and asked the city to give them permission to have a street. It took the city about 7 years before the city responded in 1913. And then in 1914, the city allowed them to have brick streets. And those brick streets were paid for and installed by the Freedmen's from Freemanstown.
Another purchase made by the settlers of Freedmanstown included 10 acres of land for a park. It was called Emancipation Park, and it still exists today.
On the corner of Houston's Emancipation Avenue,
But this would be, if we stood like this.
land purchased by freedmen Richard Allen, Richard Brock, Jack Yates, and Elias Dibble for $1,000 back in 1872. The purpose of the land, a place to celebrate Juneteenth.
It's a family event. It was a reunion. It just was a big deal. You couldn't live here without hearing about it because there were icons in our community who insisted that you knew about Juneteenth.
And just as those community icons made sure Juneteenth was celebrated generations ago, two Texas politicians have come together across the aisle to make sure the story of Juneteenth is told for generations to come by recognizing the Emancipation Trail as a national historic trail. Texas Senator John Cornyn and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee worked together on a bill to study the Emancipation Trail from Galveston to Houston. It was signed into law in January 2020. The trail is the 51-mile path those freedmen traveled from Galveston to Houston back in 1865.
How was the idea first conceived?
The idea came to some of my local historians. They had been working on it, and we say in the community, bless their souls, and they finally reached me. I was immediately inspired. I didn't want to hesitate one moment. It would be only the second trail in the national parks system ever to reflect the history of the descendants of African slaves. Selma, Civil Rights Movement, and then we in Texas.
When it comes to Juneteenth, why is it so significant not only to share this story, but make sure that it's never forgotten and that the story lives on?
It's not just people who look like me. To the contrary, this is the contribution made by African Americans here in Texas. An opportunity for people of diverse backgrounds, different races, different ethnicities to feel full ownership in the story of Texas and the story of the United States.
All the colors up there, Zinni. Yeah, you see yellow? Where's yellow? Point to yellow. Where's yellow? That one!
For Reginald Adams, his role in preserving the legacy of Juneteenth lives on through his artwork from Galveston to right here in Houston's Emancipation Park, where statues of the park's founders stand on each corner.
Our challenge was to turn that story into these monuments that honor these men and also celebrate liberation and freedom and emancipation, which is what this park stands for.
Each statue represents an element.
We call the project the Elements of Change because these men essentially were catalysts of change in their community. Jack Yates representing fire, and then we chose for David Elias Dibble near the water, near the swimming pool, blues and aquas and colors that would be reminiscent of water. And Richard Allen, he represents wind. And then on the far southwest corner is Richard Brock, and he represents earth. And so you have these very strong earth tones.
The statues stand as symbols of remembrance of the freed men and women who made a home in Houston. Senator Cornyn and Congresswoman Jackson Lee are now working to get Juneteenth recognized as a national holiday.
How wonderful it is to tell the story not in anger and not may be in anguish, though some pain will be there. That, in and of itself, it gives a sense of seriousness to it. But then you can finish the seriousness and then have people fellowshipping.
Until that day comes, Sam Collins is content with sharing the story of Juneteenth to anyone who will listen. It's his way of helping to create a new foundation for us all.
America is our home, but our home sits on a cracked foundation. And it is our responsibility in the current generation to repair the foundation and the cracks. Otherwise, future generations will have to live in a house that has a cracked foundation, and no matter how much paint you put on the walls will shift and you will have problems in that house. But there's still time to save the house and preserve the history if we would simply do the work to repair it.